Welcome into America's Forum for this Thursday. Three stories of national security importance that we want to focus on right now. Yesterday, the president formally asking the Congress for authorization of force against ISIS, while meantime in Yemen, America abandons its embassy as the Houthi rebels continue to enjoy superiority militarily with problems with the government there. And in Europe, it appears that the conflict in the Ukraine may be at least headed to a temporary form of resolution. For more on these developing stories, we are very pleased to be joined via telephone by Pat Buchanan, political commentator, author, and former senior advisor to both Presidents Nixon and Reagan, and Pete Hoekstra, who joins us from Newsmax Washington, the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Gentlemen, we thank you both very much for joining us here. Let's begin with the Ukraine. Vladimir Putin announcing an agreement in Minsk that will stop the hostilities. Pete, what is your take on that?
Well, I think once again, JD, what we're seeing here is the fortitude of this president, the United States, our European allies. We have forced Putin to do something that, he didn't want to do. That's sarcasm. That's not what we're seeing. Putin is playing us. He signed an agreement for a ceasefire. Let's see what happens on Sunday and Monday. My guess is that this doesn't change the substance. He's going to continue to be aggressive in Europe, and he's going to continue being aggressive in other parts of the world.
Pat, was Pete's sarcasm well placed, or are we honestly seeing a sea change with Putin?
I think skepticism is certainly justified. But I'm pretty heartened by this. I think the president did the right thing in not sending lethal defensive weapons like those Javelin missiles to Ukraine. I think Putin would like, I believe, to end this particular war, backing the rebels and look like a victor here. And I think the Ukrainian government is in such a situation that it cannot win a war with Russia, and the more it escalates, the more dead Ukrainians on all sides. So I'm pleased with this truth, frankly, but I have a degree of skepticism as to whether it can hold.
Let's move on to that deteriorating situation in Yemen. Reports that the Houthi rebels seized more than 25 American embassy vehicles after U.S. personnel fled the embassy and departed the country. Pete, the Marine Corps said security personnel destroyed their personal weapons before boarding a commercial flight out of Yemen. They destroyed heavier weapons such as machine guns before departing the shuttered U.S. embassy in an orderly fashion. If memory serves, Pete, you've been to that embassy. Give us your take on what's happening now in Yemen.
Well, I'm not that concerned about the transfer of the vehicles. That's not going to strategically change the situation on the ground in Yemen. When I was there in 2010, it was dangerous. I could come in for the day, but they wanted me out of there before nightfall, so it was a very quick trip in and out. Yemen's been a problem. What we have now is we've got another safe haven for radical jihadists to continue to prepare and train to attack the West. We also see that most likely the group that overthrew the existing government, they had the backing of Iran. We're seeing Iran's expansion of influence in the Middle East to continue. Our influence continues to diminish.
About a minute and a half remains. Pat Buchanan, your take on this, because Yemen was once held up as an example by President Obama.
Indeed it was. And the Houthi rebels are anti-American and anti-Israeli, but they're also anti-Al-Qaeda. And they've taken over the capital now. Obviously, they're fighters. They've taken over the capital. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is probably the leading terrorist organization that targets the United States of America. So what we've got the Iranians' allies are fighting our enemies Al-Qaeda in there. And quite clearly, the fact that the Americans flew out of there and the Marines gave up their sidearms is reflective of the fact of a general overall, I think, a retreat of the United States out of the Middle East over the long haul. And this issue there is going to be settled. And this Yemen is also part of the whole Sunni-Shia conflict throughout the Middle East, where Iran is frankly the leader of the Shia side.
Mindful of that, Pat, when we come back, we're going to focus on Capitol Hill and, quite frankly, the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, the battle that is starting over this authorization for the use of military force, or AUMF. Does it, for all intents and purposes, mean WAR? Is it war? What is the legal distinction? Back to talk about that issue with Pat Buchanan and Peter Hoekstra as America's Forum continues on this Thursday morning.
The resolution we've submitted today does not call for the deployment of U.S. ground combat forces to Iraq or Syria. It is not the authorization of another ground war, like Afghanistan or Iraq. At the same time, this resolution strikes the necessary balance by giving us the flexibility we need for unforeseen circumstances.
President Obama yesterday trying to make the case for his request for the authorization of the use of military force against ISIS, saying congressional passage of that measure will prove the U.S. strongest in the fight. He also went on to proclaim that ISIS is going to lose. But is this request more bark than bite? And might it tie the hands of our next commander-in-chief? Let's continue the conversation now with our guest, former Congressman Peter Hoekstra and longtime presidential advisor Pat Buchanan, who counseled both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Gentlemen, thanks to you both. Senator and potential 2016 presidential candidate Ted Cruz was among many in the Republican Party questioning the president, saying that Mr. Obama's response lacks a, quote, seriousness of purpose. Pat, do you agree with Ted Cruz's assessment?
Not necessarily. I think this is an excellent exercise. I've argued for a long time that the Congress of the United States should be brought aboard, and frankly should say yes or no to all of these wars and these American interventions. And I think the debate that's going to be forced here is a good one, J.D., and for this reason. Look, President Obama said we're going to degrade and defeat ISIS. Now, we can degrade and we can contain ISIS with what we're doing now, but to defeat them, they're going to need an army in Iraq, presumably the Iraqi army and the Kurds, and they're going to need troops in Syria in the scores of thousands who presently do not exist as an army. So I think that this forces the Congress of the United States to sit down, debate, and determine what it's going to take to win the war, and after we win it, who sits in Damascus, for example, to answer these questions, I think is extremely healthy.
From the other perspective, Peter Hoekstra, our old congressional colleague Matt Thornberry now chairs the House Armed Services Committee. He says he's concerned the rules of engagement would be too confining, and any American fighting forces would have to have a lawyer alongside to make out all the legalese.
Well, what you've got here, J.D., number one, I agree with Pat. This debate needs to happen in Congress. It needs to be a serious debate about what the threats are, how we're going to confront and contain these threats, who's going to do the fighting, and all of those kinds of things. The AUMF, this authorization of use of military force, that's the context. The document itself, I'm not going to say it's meaningless because remember, number one, the president says, I don't need it. I already have the authorization to act. I can do whatever I need to do, so I don't need it. The second thing is it's written vaguely enough that you've got people on the left who say it gives the president too much authority. You've got people on the right who are saying it's not aggressive enough. The president leads this new authorization, use of force, I think gives this president and future presidents enough flexibility to do whatever they want. A restrained approach, a very aggressive approach. The debate I think, is the most important thing of this process.
Pat, the notion of setting this for a time certain, 3 years, some critics say, well, it tells the enemy how long we're willing to commit. Others say this carries past the Obama presidency. Your take on that time limit?
Well, that doesn't really concern me greatly because, let's assume that ISIS somehow, the king of Jordan fell and ISIS moved into that area. everybody knows a changed situation that was as dramatic and dangerous as that, it looked like it was going to tip the balance against us in the whole Middle East, would cause an immediate debate and frankly, the authorization of the president to do what it took to prevent that. So I don't think it's a bad thing at all that the time limit's on it. If the Republicans got control of both houses of Congress and the presidency, they could extend it and expand it. The Democrats, they would have it there. They wouldn't have to use it. Again, I agree with Pete on this. I think the debate and what are we doing and who do we want to win ultimately this war, we know who we're against, but a lot of our allies there, for example, in Syria, our allies are Hezbollah de facto, Iran, Assad, and Russia fighting against ISIS. And so I think for people to sit down and talk this over and think it through where we are going and for what we should spend American blood is an excellent exercise.
Pete, about 25 seconds remains for your assessment. Will this be a very deliberate, drawn-out debate on the Hill?
I think it will be. There will be a significant number of congressional hearings. I hope it is a very, very serious debate. It is what America needs. I'm not convinced that at the end of the process you'll actually pass any legislation.
Well, we appreciate your assessment from the Hill, and Patrick J. Buchanan, as one who advised two presidents and ran for the presidency yourself, we thank you for offering the other side of the coin, at least from an executive perspective. But, Pat, you've always been right from the beginning, the title of one of your books, so we appreciate it. To you both, our thanks. America's Forum. We'll be right back.